You're listening to the Study Legal English podcast, helping lawyers and law students become fluent in legal English. For more information, visit studylegalenglish.com. Hello and welcome to the Study Legal English podcast, episode 118. I'm your host Louise, and today I'm going to be talking to you about the area of property law, real property law to be precise, and the work of a real property lawyer. I chose this topic because firstly it's an area that I've not really covered before, and it's of particular interest to me at the moment because I am looking at buying my first house. So I'm very excited about this. That should be happening at some point this year, fingers crossed. So before we get started, I want to ask you a question. Do you work in real property law? And if so, what's your typical day like? Let me know. Send me an email to louise@studylegalenglish.com or join me on social media. Just search for the Study Legal English group on Facebook or at Legal Englisher on Instagram. So I want to remind you that if you're a member of my website, studylegalenglish.com, you can access your benefits over on the website. And if you're not a member, then go to studylegalenglish.com/pricing to check out the member options. If you are interested in becoming a member, but you're thinking, when's Louise going to run a promotion? Well, you should sign up to my newsletter. Just go to studylegalenglish.com/news to make sure that you're kept up to date on when I give discounts and promotions. So let's go. What is property law? Property law is an area of law which deals with ownership and tenancy of real property. Real property means buildings and land. Sometimes this area of law is called real estate law because real property and real estate are synonyms. That means you can use them synonymously, they mean the same thing. Real property is different from intellectual property because intellectual property relates to ideas and concepts. For example, the design of something or an idea for an invention. Intellectual property normally refers to intangible things, whereas real property normally refers to tangible things. So, real estate law or real property law can involve both commercial or personal property. Commercial property relates to property used for business purposes, for example, a company buying an office or leasing a building. Personal property relates to residential property used for personal or non-commercial purposes. For example, an individual buying a home, exactly what I hope to be doing this year. So, what do real property lawyers do? Property lawyers mostly deal with transactional work. This means they do work related to transactions, to business deals, to deals between individuals, such as buying or selling or leasing of property. However, some property lawyers may also be involved in litigation if disputes arise. So let's look in more detail at buying real property. Parties in these transactions can be called the buyer and the seller. You may also see the terms purchaser and seller. Of course, the exact process will differ depending on the circumstances, but generally this is kind of what happens when someone buys a house and how a lawyer is involved in the process. So when a person or a company wants to buy a property, they will first go and look around the property with an estate agent. A property or estate agent is a company that advertises and manages property for sale or lease. You may also hear the term realtor, although that's generally used more in the USA than in England. So if the buyer wants to go ahead with the purchase, the buyer may make an offer or put in an offer, and the seller may make a counter offer. And then the parties should hopefully be able to reach an agreement on price. The buyer will also ask a property lawyer for advice early on in the process. The lawyer may carry out due diligence on the property, such as by carrying out searches, such as an investigation of title. This investigation of title involves checking all the property deeds are correct and valid, and that the property advertised for sale is indeed the property being sold, and the owner, who's allegedly the owner, is indeed the owner of the property. The property lawyer may give advice about the property, for example, advising on which taxes will be due. In England, when you buy a property, under certain conditions, you have to pay a tax called stamp duty land tax. And I know that certainly in pretty much most countries, these taxes exist. Just maybe they're called something different. The lawyer may also advise the buyer on getting a mortgage or financing the purchase. The word mortgage in general English is really used to refer to the loan which a borrower gets from the bank. We often talk informally, we say that, oh, I need to get a mortgage. And when we say that, we really mean I need to get a loan from the bank. However, technically, it actually refers to the interest which a bank has over the property as a guarantee for a loan. So the mortgage actually refers to the interest the bank has over the property. It doesn't refer to the money, to the actual loan that a person gets. So the borrower, the person who gets the loan, is called the mortgagor because they give the interest in their property in return for borrowing money, and the bank is the mortgagee, the party that receives the interest. And when I say interest, I mean a right. I don't mean an interest in terms of interest on money, although of course a bank does charge interest. There's many different meanings of interest, and here when I say that the bank has an interest over the property, I mean they have a right to the property. Interestingly, the word mortgage comes from Old French. Mort meaning dead or death, and gage meaning pledge. Apparently, this is because the pledge, the interest over the property, dies when the borrower, the person who's borrowing the money, has paid off the money. So it's an agreement that can actually die, the interest in the land or the property that can die once the mortgagor actually repays the loan. So what else happens in this process? The buyer will also probably instruct a surveyor. This is a person who examines the condition of the land and the buildings for an interested buyer before the exchange of contracts. They create reports about the risks or problems of a building. For example, they might say that the roof is faulty, it needs replacing, or the foundations of the building, the lower part, the underground part of the building, is not in a good state, and that there's a risk for the buyer. And the property lawyer will be very hands-on, working with the client and also liaising with the estate agent, the seller's lawyer, and the surveyor throughout the purchasing process. Other aspects of the deal may need to be negotiated and agreed upon, and the lawyer may act on behalf of their client, the buyer or the seller, in order to negotiate those final aspects of the sale and purchase agreement. Once the parties have agreed on all the terms, these will be drawn up by the seller's lawyer, most likely, in a contract of sale and purchase. Later, there will be the exchange of contracts. This is when the two legal firms representing the buyer and the seller swap the signed contracts, the contracts which have been signed by the buyer and the seller. And the buyer normally here has to pay a deposit. And at this point, this is when the parties are bound by the agreement. So when there's the exchange of contracts, this is when the parties are bound by the agreement, and they can't really get out of the contract unless something goes wrong. Because within the purchase and sale agreement, there may be certain things that the parties have to do before completion. And if these aren't followed through, if something goes wrong, then yes, the deal may fall through. Otherwise, the parties are bound by it. So there may be a couple of weeks or more to wait until completion, and this is the date the property is transferred and the money for the purchase is paid to the seller by the buyer. The buyer pays for the property and the ownership of the property is transferred to the buyer. The buyer becomes the new owner. Post-completion, the lawyer will have to carry out some of these tasks, such as registering the new owner of the property with the authorities. In England, the authority dealing with registry is called the Land Registry. Note that in England, this transfer of property can be done by a conveyancer. A licensed conveyancer is a person who has taken a conveyancing qualification to become this type of professional. And it's not necessary to be a qualified lawyer to be a conveyancer. So a conveyancer does conveyancing, which means the procedures involved in transferring the ownership of land or property. So let's turn now to leases. A lease is where a person pays money to use the property but does not buy the ownership of the property, doesn't buy the property. It may also be called a tenancy. So where a person or a company wants to lease a property from the owner, again, they may instruct a lawyer for advice. The lawyer may carry out due diligence, and the lawyer may need to get permission from local authorities to make changes to the property, to make alterations, or in commercial leases to authorise a particular activity that the company will carry out on the property. The lawyer who is acting for the landlord will probably provide a contract called a lease agreement or tenancy agreement, and the lawyers involved who are acting for each of the parties, the landlord and the tenant, will each advise their clients on their particular obligations under the lease. Let's look at some of the words here. Note that landlord and tenant or lessor and lessee can be used. Landlord and lessor mean the person who owns the property. Tenant and lessee mean the person renting or leasing the property. Also note that a lease could be called a rental agreement or a tenancy agreement. So let's do a little quiz to test to see if you've been listening. Let's do a recap on some of that vocabulary. I'm going to ask you a question, you'll hear a beep, and then you should say your answer. Then I'm going to say the answer and you can see if you were correct. So, number 1, what's the difference between real property and real estate? Here's the answer. Nothing, they're interchangeable terms. Number 2, what is conveyancing? Here's the answer. Conveyancing is the work related to transferring the ownership of real property. Number 3. How can you call a person who leases or rents a property? Here's the answer. You can call them a lessee or a tenant. Next question. How do you call a person who takes a loan from a bank to pay for a house? Here's the answer. You would call them a mortgagor or, more simply, a borrower. Finally, how do you call the person who buys property? Here's the answer. You call that person the buyer or the purchaser. Great. So that's the end of this episode. I hope you found it useful and learned something new. Don't forget to answer my question. Do you work in real property law? If so, what's your typical day like? Let me know. Send me an email to louise@studylegalenglish.com or join me on social media. Just search for the Study Legal English group, or you can find me at Legal Englisher on other platforms. Of course, if you're a member, head over to studylegalenglish.com for all your membership benefits. If you're not signed up to my newsletter, you can do so. Head over to studylegalenglish.com/news. Yes, I do send out newsletters where sometimes I run promotions on membership. So if you're interested in that, then do sign up. And of course, if you're interested in becoming a member, then head over to studylegalenglish.com/pricing to check out the membership options. So thanks for listening and see you next time. Thanks for listening to the Study Legal English podcast. If you really want to get ahead, why not become a member and gain access to many learning resources? Visit studylegalenglish.com/pricing.